So my name's Corey Barstow.
And I'm Jordan.
And we're the co-vice chairs of conference for the Society of Water Institute graduate students. And we want to thank you all for joining us for World Water Day 2026.
This morning, we're excited to introduce Dr. Katie Meehan, who will share her research on the emergence of infrastructure inequality and water poverty in the global north. Dr. Meehan is a political ecology and environmental geographer exploring the intersections between water governance, social reproduction, environmental justice, and climate change adaptation. Dr. Meehan is a professor of environmental justice at King's College London and is the co-director of the King's Water Centre. She also earned a doctorate at the University of Arizona, a Master's of Science from the University of Oxford, and has co-authored the book Water, A Critical Introduction. Please give a round of applause to welcome Dr. Katie Meehan.
I've got this. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Someone stole my talk. Oh, it's hiding. Julie was on it. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I am really honored to be here. It's been great meeting people. I got the honor to meet graduate students and staff yesterday, faculty as well. And I look forward to the poster event. I love a poster event as a geographer. And I'm just really excited to be here and share some insights from the Plumbing Poverty Project, which I direct and I'll explain a little bit more about, and also to hear about your work and what you're up to as well. So sometimes when we academics do this sort of thing, we wonder if anyone's ever reading or listening to what we have to say, and people are. So it's really nice to have that dialogue and get a chance to learn from you and with you as well. Barcelona is perhaps not the first place that people associate with water poverty. But on a Wednesday evening in June, as the hot Mediterranean sun baked tourist and stag parties in the city's old quarter, a small group of residents came together in a plain office to share their stories of water and energy debt, shut-offs and disconnections, tips and advice, and the struggles of life without water. The first to share is Anthony, a migrant worker from Latin America, now living in Barcelona, who tells us that his water has been cut off for 14 months. He lives with 7 other people, including 5 children and his elderly mother. Several volunteers from APE, or the Alliance Against Energy Poverty, listen intently to his case. Because Anthony is registered in his flat, they point him to the option of requesting a social water meter, an assistance program for vulnerable households from the water provider. Anthony looks very relieved. Launched in 2014, APE is a social movement formed in the wake of the global financial and housing crisis, when millions of Spaniards suffered bankruptcy and lost their homes to investors. APE promotes solidarity among people affected by utility poverty, often organizing direct action and sit-ins pictured here. That same year, APE organized a ballot measure on housing and human rights, passed unanimously by the Catalan parliament in 2015. Significantly, this law was the first legislation in Spain to articulate needs like housing, water, and energy as human rights, to officially recognize water and energy poverty, and to develop a response mechanism, the social meter program. Between 2015 and 2020, the program installed more than 1,000 social meters across Catalonia in 27 different municipalities. Twice per month, APE runs advice sessions in Barcelona affected by people like Anthony, affected by energy and water poverty like Anthony. These meetings are open to all and act as sites to share knowledge, create momentum for collective action, and navigate the bureaucracy of the poverty machine. Stories are often harrowing, revealing the daily struggles and sheer amount of work involved to secure water. Take, for example, Shema from Hospitalet, a district in Barcelona. She lived in a rented flat with her mother and paid her water bill every month until she ran into financial trouble due to loss of her job. In April 2025, her water service was cut off. APE advised her to go immediately to social services, where she had never been before. She'd never heard about the social meter program either. 6 months later, Shema was still without water service. At the November meeting, she explained that social services had refused to process her case because her income was too high in the previous year when she had a steady job. At the time, Shema was looking for work and taking care of her mother. She was 9 months pregnant. Their only source of water was from the city's public fountains, which Shema hauled to their flat in plastic containers. Water poverty and inequality are often treated as a technical error or aberration in the global north. Yet Shema's case prompts a critical set of questions. Why does water poverty persist in some of the world's wealthiest places? What are the hidden costs of deficient social infrastructures? Who bears the burden of water poverty in the global north? And why should we even consider it work? And those are some of the questions I'm hoping to unpack today. My first goal today is that you leave this room thinking of water inequality not as a breakdown or failure, but the system working as intended. Taking inspiration from political ecology, feminist labor geographies, and critical poverty scholarship, I show how households first cope with a lack, loss, or denial of running water, and second, navigate systems of welfare assistance that displace the time horizon of actually eradicating poverty. To bracket my approach, I update and apply the concept of work transfer, first introduced by a sociologist, Nona Glaser, to explain the dynamics and logics that shape the production of water poverty. Glaser sought to use the term to defend the value of reproductive labor to capitalist society, but I'm going to give it a little different twist as a method to trace the ways that capital and the state abdicate the labor of water provision onto others. I argue that the lack of household access to running water and its enforced denial through shutoffs and debt mechanisms results in a work transfer from capital and the state to households. So this takes me to my second goal, to reveal the dual nature of the welfare state under racial capitalism. And I take the inspiration from Cedric Robinson, who argues that all capitalism is racial capitalism. The work transfer is not an innocent handoff. It is policed as a form of class rule. In this talk, I will describe a police state of water, sharing experiences of people who must endure stigma, intimidation, harassment, ridicule, dismissal, bankruptcy, eviction, injury, and thirst in their efforts to secure water and reproduce their lives and their households. The two cases I describe here, Barcelona and New York City, are progressive jurisdictions, nice places, with the human right to water recognized by their state constitutions. Barcelona, as I mentioned, even has a program to prevent utility disconnections, but it don't matter. Today I demonstrate that these cases are not accidents or abnormal, but reveal the system as it's designed to operate. Okay. So why should we consider water as a form of work? This is some research, this slide, well, part of this is I'm thinking about with a collaboration network of people called the Household Water Insecurity Experiences. During the 1970s and 80s, feminist labor scholars and activists advanced critiques of capitalism that centered unwaged labor, specifically unpaid domestic labor, in the life-sustaining work that regenerates labor power and capitalism more generally. The housework debates, as they came to be known, pivoted on the contention of whether or not reproductive labor should be considered value-generating for capital. I'm going to put that debate aside, but acknowledging it's out there. In 1975, American sociologist Nona Glaser introduced the idea of work transfer. For Glaser, work is defined as those activities which produce goods or provide services and or provide for the circulation of goods and services which are directly or indirectly for capitalism, so a very wide palette. In an important move, Glaser framed the work of household social reproduction as relational and not simply located in the home, but across a shifting constellation of households, firms, and the state. All of this is involved in reproducing life. More precisely, as the book After Work argues, reproductive labor is in a variety of contexts, waged and unwaged, in the home and elsewhere, and encompasses categories like care work, domestic work, and housework without being equivalent to them. But what specifically is the work transfer? For Glaser, the subsumption of certain unwaged activities by firms or their absorption by the state is what she calls the work transfer. All of these transformations hinge on a social reorganization of reproductive labor over time and over place, and this is very uneven. As a geographer, I see the geography in this. In her work, in her words, work that may have once been done in the home is subsequently taken over by capitalism or the state, as well as the work that came into existence only because of capitalism it's reorganized. This reorganization takes the form of shifting once paid work to consumers, making it part of consumption. And consumption was a really key site for Glaser. Her 1984 book, Servants to Capital, analyzed transformations in retail in the United States from about 1916 to the 80s, showing how paid work became unpaid labor carried out by consumers while purchasing goods and services. And a contemporary analogy of this might be, I don't know if they have this in Canada, but in the UK, self-checkout services in supermarkets. This became popular in the UK over the pandemic in Tesco and Sainsbury's. And these retailers argued that these checkout machines would be great for us. They would provide speed and convenience for the consumer. Glaser would delight at the proof that now the consumer does more free work for capital, right? It's sort of essentially a giant labor-saving device. Now we're doing everything. Not everything, but a lot. Marx might argue that, this is a direct quote, enthusiastic apologies of the factory system have to say about the prospect of generally organizing social labor is this: it would transform all of society into a factory. While I diverge from Glaser on several key points, which I can elaborate on, in the Q&A. Here in this talk, I really seek to repurpose this idea of the work transfer as a lens to reveal the work of water, how the waged work of water disappears from view in state-supported systems of provision, like public tap water, which are collectively organized systems managed by the state. And conversely, this lens allows us to see how this work reappears for households without ready access. The work transfer, then, is fundamentally about the organization of social reproduction across space and the relations of social power that underpin these spatial and social shifts. In countries like the United States and Spain, the state became involved in water because one of the reasons, because it was able to provide drinking water at scale to a set population at subsidized rates in a more efficient way through networked infrastructures, a task that otherwise fell to individuals, households, or communities. What happens when this is reversed? And that's the topic of today's lecture. So I'll explain a little bit about the project. The insights I'll talk about today are built on firsthand investigative research in Barcelona, Catalonia, and Spain, and New York City in the US. The Plumbing Poverty is a 5-year study funded by the European Research Council aimed at explaining the production of insecure water access and shutoffs in cities across Europe and the United States. Currently, our work is based on cross-cultural research design using ethnographic and qualitative data collected from 6 metro regions as case studies. So I'm going to draw research from 2 sites, the metro regions of Barcelona and New York. Both cities are celebrated as models of urban design, sustainable planning, and civic engagement. Nevertheless, both cities are also experiencing widening levels of income inequality, a severe lack of affordable housing, cost of living crises, especially for low-income households, and compounding threats from climate change and heat extremes. I gathered evidence in Barcelona starting in 2023 and continuing for 3 months last year, while my PhD researcher, Lucy Everett, collected data in New York during 6 months in 2025. We observed public meetings and assemblies, collected secondary data and materials, and interviewed people in government, water management, civil society organizations, charities, law firms, and households themselves that were affected by water debt, shutoffs, or access problems. I used thematic analysis of first cut to kind of understand things, but really the claims I developed in this paper came together as I toggled between people's firsthand experiences and key categories of explanation in labor geographies and political ecology. Following Marx, my method here is to lift the veil on the chaotic concrete, a term that so aptly describes the manufactured crisis of water poverty, in order to parse out the logics and dynamics that are truly at work. So, first I want to elaborate the work transfer by exploring the unwaged labor that households take on to cope with a lack, loss, or denial of running water, a service that is typically provided by the state or private water companies in advanced capitalist societies like the US and Spain. In cases like New York City, for example, most of the work of supplying, treating, and providing water is assumed by state institutions. In New York City, the water provider is the city's Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP. When I say that acronym, that's who it is. When these relations break down, however, the costs of that labor become evident as work is transferred onto households. So this diagram that I developed with some collaborators is trying to articulate the cost of providing water, especially as households begin to assume that labor. We developed this classification scheme to sort of recognize, for example, the financial costs, money, but also financial resources, costs of time, the physical costs, the kind of energy it takes to obtain and move water, sometimes which leads to injury, the administrative costs, the kind of project management and knowledge and know-how that it takes to navigate systems. Sometimes I hear the youths call it life admin, which I like, as well as the relational costs. We'll come back to this. But for working class households, water's financial costs, the money and financial resources needed to access water, can quickly spiral. In the New York neighborhood of Jamaica, Queens, Stella lives in a home she has owned for 20 years. Working as a nursing assistant, Stella takes care of clients across the city despite having disabilities that restrict her mobility. When she bought her house in 2004, her water bills were modest, about $150 every 3 months. In 2024, however, Stella received a letter from Saks, a contractor for DEP, the public water provider, asking for access to her water meter. Stella complied. The contractor changed the meter and left without explanation. A week later, Stella received a fine for $650. So I reached out and called them. She said, "You wait forever." Then nobody answers, so I give up. I keep calling 2-3 times until I get someone. She's calling, she says, "I'm trying to get someone." They're like, "Well, you can make a payment plan." And she said, "But for what?" "Well," the person said, "it looked like a fine or something." And she said, "But for what? Could you please explain it to me?" And she described it like a runaround, like a circle. And finally, she became depressed about it and just hung up. You know? Yes, I know. The initial charge started at $650 and rapidly escalated. Stella made trips to the DEP office and tried to get to the bottom of the situation. One time she brought a friend, Sylvia, a teacher. Happened to be spring break. She worked in a school. She said, "Stella, I'll go with you to DEP." She figures, it's my American friend. She's a smarty pants. She understands your twang. We get there, and the DEP officer says, "Well, it must be a leak or something in the house." Stella says, "What? It's $3,000 already. A leak? What is going on? And she was frustrated because they wouldn't talk to you. And she mentioned something interesting. She said they have a guard there, and I've witnessed other people that have issues and they're trying to get a resolution, but the office is not answering their questions. They say, make a payment plan, and if the person asks the same questions or is getting a little frustrated, the guard stands up and comes over there. Stella's debt accrued quickly with interest and late fees. By November 2025, her bill was $9,312. In our most recent communication, we're in contact with her regularly. She owed just over $11,000, a substantial outlay for a low-wage care worker accumulated over just 18 months. Stella is now at risk of being included in the lien sale. The lien sale represents a new frontier and next level in the financial costs of water. Under Mayor Eric Adams, the city government included water debt in its property lien sale, a city-brokered market of selling unresolved debt collection, such as cases like Stella's, to private investors. Under Adams, DEP also brought back its favorite enforcement mechanism, the water shutoff. To briefly illustrate how the lien operates, let me share a news clip from a local news agency in New York. Okay. Ooh.
But first,
it's rough, it's tough. I cannot eat, I cannot drink, I cannot sleep.
a homeowner spends decades paying off his mortgage only to suddenly find out his home has been sold in an auction without his knowledge. So how could this happen? It's a 7 on Your Side investigation. And good evening to you. At 6 o'clock, I'm Liz Cho. Bill is off tonight. We are going to begin with that stunning story of a man fighting to keep his home. He worked for 22 years to pay off the mortgage on his home in Brooklyn, only to find out that it was auctioned off. He had been paying his water bill, but it turns out there was an old bill he never knew about. But the city sold the debt to a private investor who then sold his $800,000 home at an auction. And thousands of New Yorkers could be at risk of the very same thing. Investigative reporter Dan Krauth is here now with the exclusive report. Dan.
Liz, the city takes action against people who don't pay their property taxes or water bills. It is leading to people losing their homes. In this case, it's for a bill that was worth less than 1% of the value of his home. In the middle of the night, this is what the Brown family in Brooklyn woke up to. Strangers using power tools to try to get into their home, only to find later those strangers had a legal right to be there.
I don't want anybody to go through what I'm going through. It's more than I can bear.
Fillmore Brown bought his home back in 1996, worked 7 days a week for more than 2 decades to pay it off, only to learn it was sold out from under him.
It's rough, it's tough. I cannot eat, I cannot drink, I cannot sleep. I cannot stay at the house.
That was your American dream.
That was my dream, only dream.
Back in 2019, Brown had just finished paying off the mortgage, but says he didn't know he had an unpaid water bill for $5,000. Did you know that you had an outstanding water bill?
No. If I didn't know, I would pay just as I paid the balance.
Here's what happens in New York City with larger unpaid water and tax bills. The city sells the unpaid bills to what's called a trust, which is a group of investors. It's then up to those investors to collect the money with interest. If the balance isn't paid, the home can go into foreclosure and be bought at auction. That's what happened to Mr. Brown.
It's stolen from me, and I need it back.
The city says they sent numerous notices warning him of a pending lien, notices Mr. Brown says he did not receive. Court documents then show the investor served someone at his home with papers in November of 2020 during the height of the pandemic that they were foreclosing. Mr. Brown claims he didn't get it.
I would pay it with no problem.
He lives on the top floor of his home and rents out the lower 2 units to other families.
He said he didn't know anything about this, and I believe him.
The attorneys working on his case say he has paid thousands of dollars in taxes and water bills since then.
He just paid a water bill this year, in the thousands of dollars. So it's just heart-wrenching.
She says once his old bill was put into trust, it did not show up on his current bills. The two payment systems aren't connected.
There needs to be some notification that there's another bill out there to be paid.
The city's Department of Finance responded with a statement that reads in part, "Our goal is never to see a homeowner lose their property. Last year, we implemented reforms to specifically prevent unfortunate situations like this from happening by giving property owners more time, information, and resources to resolve their debts." As for Mr. Brown, his attorney's now trying to get a judge to pause the case so she can explain to the court what happened. Do you have hope?
Yeah, I have hopes. If I didn't have hopes, I wouldn't be here today.
We will be following his case, and he's not alone. Just this year, more than 6,800 people had their water liens put into a trust for not paying their water bills. Our ABC data team found a majority of them live in minority neighborhoods. And Liz, some city council members are taking action. They're holding a rally outside of his home tomorrow. They want a public hearing to investigate what went wrong and a new bill passed to try to prevent something like this from happening again.
That is exactly what needs to happen, because I think the most diligent homeowner wouldn't even know to ask questions or go searching for something like that if they're never notified.
Once it's put in that trust, it's deducted from the account, so you can have a zero balance but still have a lien from the trust and not know about it if you're not looking or paying attention to your bills closely.
Absolutely mind-blowing.
Yes.
So PhD researcher Lucy Everett, who's brilliant and a plumbing poverty team member, has done extensive research on New York's system of water debt, shutoffs, and racialized dispossession, as well as the lien. She is my lien expert. So stay tuned for her thesis and publications. We're working on an article right now, which will explore the production and carceral nature of water debt in more depth as a driver of plumbing poverty. But I will say that the property lien is a very common mechanism across the U.S. It's very unremarked, but water debt is a new thing that's being added as a form of property to many of these like legal property mechanisms, really as a revenue generator for city administrations. Lucy. Financial costs are also triggered by less obvious mechanisms at the nexus of housing and water. In Barcelona, a tight housing market with few affordable options, renters must cope with added layers of financial and time costs. For example, Silviana lived with her son in a rented house with irregular connections to water and electricity, a situation that she inherited from a previous tenant. She received a water fraud notice and was given just 15 days to regularize the situation, sending her into a panic. Fanny, also a renter, suspected that her water account was registered for commercial use as she received super high bills. Her landlord refused to transfer ownership of the account to Fanny, which would have allowed her to fix the situation. He also refused to complete the certification process that verifies that the apartment is for residential and not commercial use. These examples speak to some of the time, financial, and administrative costs that households must bear. Because affordable housing is scarce in the Barcelona metro region, landlords have outsized power, including power over the human right to water. In an increasingly common scenario across Catalonia, lower-income households will squat in unoccupied houses and buildings. Maria and her family occupied a vacant home owned by a vulture fund in a small town outside the city of Tarragona. One day, local police showed up, notified by the management company, and cut off their water service, sort of a method of eviction. Despite a 10-year-old law that guarantees uninterrupted service for households recognized as vulnerable, water shutoffs and housing evictions by police, and even worse, private gangs, racist sort of far-right gangs hired by landlords, I can talk about that in Q&A, are growing in Catalonia, pictured here. By the time Maria attended the APE meeting in Barcelona, her family had lived without running water for 13 months. One of the more pivotal but hidden dimensions of water insecurity are its relational costs, the emotional work of building and maintaining social relationships to secure water. Participants cultivated these relations in strategic and diverse ways. In Barcelona, people without water relied on family and friends, sought APE assemblies or social services for advice, and reached informal service agreements or payment arrangements with neighbors. On occasion, APE draws on its networks to escalate egregious cases, such as this social media post to the far right here. They have also organized sit-ins and occupations of utility offices, protests, and awareness campaigns to maintain that right to water in the public spotlight. In New York, where protective measures like the social meter program do not exist, and the system is fiercely geared towards accumulation from debt, people have fewer options in terms of organizational resources or even legal and financial advice. Without an organized movement like APE, squarely focused on collective organizing against utility debt, New Yorkers are left to tackle a structural problem with individual relations and resources. At one point, Stella brought her friend to the DEP office to help advocate her case. You know, it's not like I have a college degree, Stella told us, but I understand basic English. Still, she figured that a white-collar professional like her friend might command respect and get answers from city governance. Sylvia is feisty, Stella told us. She knows how to speak your American language. What language is that? In this second part of the talk, I argue that the work transfer of water poverty is in fact policed and enforced, a contemporary form of class rule. You will not find this argument in United Nations reports, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the like. In such accounts, the causes of water inequality tend to be ascribed to funding shortfalls or governance failure, or if the UN is feeling spicy, attributed to private sector actors. I think of all the UN special rapporteurs for drinking water and rights to sanitation, Leo Heller, who's from Brazil, his work was probably the most spicy of the special rapporteurs to really point out the role of private water actors globally shaping these relations of inequality. How does the work transfer actually work? In Western democracies, the transformation of the welfare state regime and the sale or abandonment of public services since the 1970s has been made visible by a robust critical literature. But as I track how the work of water is expunged onto households, I wish to emphasize its enforced nature. The set of institutions that govern and manage poverty, what the plumbing poverty team calls the poverty technocracy, is in fact dependent on a police structure. Marxist theorist and cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall once argued that race is the modality in which class is lived. Building on this line of thought, geographer and prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore has argued that if race is the lived modality of class, then mass incarceration and criminalization and the policing it depends on is a form of class war. Key to Gilmore and Hall's formulation is the idea that policing is a structure, a set of hegemonic conditions and institutions that enforce market rule under capitalism. And as I argue in a recent paper, this structure extends to water. Policing the household indebtedness of water through shutoffs, in fact, is profitable. It maintains powerful leverage over households. It masquerades as a boring and technical necessity, even as it shackles and dispossesses a racialized surplus population. It hides behind neutral market logic as it ticks over the human revenue stream. It creates new inroads for accumulation on the back of life's work. Utility debt can reach low-income households even where mortgages cannot. In this framework, what appears as welfare, a system to support people through service provision and assistance, also functions as a structure of compliance under market rule. Policing is enacted in various ways and through different actors, including those at the front line of service provision. This is Stella again. They've got a guard there. I've witnessed other people that have issues. The guard gets up, blah, blah, blah. He stands up and comes right over. He's dressed as a guard. She says, you would think it's a police officer, but it's a guard. It's a guard there to intimidate people. And this is DEP, she says. We pay taxes. We are the taxpayers. Tactics of disinterest, threat, or even intimidation were not uncommon in either New York City or Barcelona. In some examples, these conditions were perpetuated by municipal offices charged with providing social services. Laura, a resident of Carcassent, Valencia, has been living without her family, including a child and 2 babies, for 4 months without access to electricity or water. Like her, other families in her building are in precarious employment and do not receive any kind of protection from local authorities or the Valencia Community Administration, which is a different province than Catalonia. On the contrary, they are immersed in a hate campaign. Among the violations, they have reported threats of withdrawal of custody of their children as a preliminary step to accessing a temporary shelter, blocking of the newborn's registry, the prohibition of the eldest child going to school if they continue to live in the flat, or even cutting off of public water supplies in the neighborhood in the middle of a heat wave. I will note that this use of children as leverage points is not an anomaly, something we've heard multiple times. In one of the New York interviews, an informant explained that even when income was short, she always paid her water bill because if there were a shutoff, Child and Protective Services would come and take her children away. Stress is also a product of the work transfer, a psychosocial response to situations of water insecurity and also conditions of disinterest, harassment, entrapment, and enforcement by the poverty technocracy. Research in public health and social sciences has strongly correlated water insecurity with stress, anxiety, worry, and poor mental health. What our research reveals, however, is that these scenarios reach deep into the institutions that govern and manage water poverty. This is Stella. What happened is they try to put this fear in you, like, oh, it's going to be terrible. It's going to cost you thousands of dollars. She says, I won't lie to you. I've become so afraid that I haven't opened some of my notice letters because I'm afraid of how much it could be. I'm afraid to leave my house. Vicky from Badalona speaks about the mistreatment she received at the office in Universitat. In her case, she did not receive the bills and asked the office to let her know which bills she had paid and which did not. The workers did not want to share this information with her, despite having the right to do so. This is not the first time that the utility workers had treated with disdain members of the APE assembly. In some cases, they file complaints. The creation of Barcelona's social meter program, a direct result of social struggle and the 2015 law, introduces new layers of state bureaucracy, admin work, and power relations that households must navigate. As Hirim Yoon and David Saudi argue, the process puts municipal social services in a very influential role, since they are now responsible for determining which households are vulnerable or at risk of poverty, and therefore protected from shutoffs. APE sessions were filled with people who either did not know about the social meter program or who were denied approval. In one case, as I mentioned, social services said a woman earned too much the year before to be considered vulnerable. In other cases, people had to juggle multiple systems and a confusing labyrinth of assistance. Fortunata, for example, lived with 2 children without water, and social services had repeatedly denied her vulnerability report. She was advised to first obtain a certificate of habitability prior to reapplying for the social meter program. If anyone has experienced Spanish bureaucracy, my sympathies are with you. As these examples suggest, rather than eradicate the problem of water poverty, the welfare state has rearranged the institutional configuration and management of poverty and poverty assistance. The result, as these stories suggest, are individual solutions applied to a structural problem. The individual client, as they call them, is tasked with the administrative, relational, financial, and time burdens of proving their poverty status to the state, all the while absorbing the financial, time, and physical costs of securing alternative sources of water. And even people's stopgap measures are policed, particularly in climates that seek to punish low-income migrants. Across Southern Europe, in countries such as Italy and Spain, free public drinking water fountains are enjoyed across plazas, parks, schools, streets, and many public spaces. You'll see these everywhere. In December 2025, the mayor and city council of Martorell, a town outside Barcelona, passed a measure to prohibit the collection of water from fountains with jugs, bottles, or storage utensils of any kind, and announced fines of up to €750. This measure comes in addition to the refusal of the Martorell City Council to register and install social meters in occupied homes. In the words of the mayor himself, the aim is to, quote, make life more difficult for people living in precarious housing. Water inequality, especially in the global north, is often treated as an aberration or a technical failure by an otherwise liberal social order and democratic society, shored up by aspirational social systems and provisioning infrastructures. This presentation, I hope, serves to crack open that assumption and reveal the inner workings of a system that is actually working as intended. Taking a labor-centric approach, I explore the unwaged reproductive labor that households must take on to cope with a lack, loss, or denial of running water. And second, deploy in order to navigate these systems of welfare assistance that simply displace the time horizon of actually eradicating poverty. When capital and the state abdicate the provision of water, or when water service is actively denied, this results in a work transfer to unwaged household labor. In cities like Barcelona and New York, this transfer is a reversal of historic trends that Glaser described across the 20th century, when capital absorbed and reorganized select activity of collective or household social reproduction, like cooking, cleaning, making clothes, laundry, and transformed them into consumer goods and commercial services. Instead, the current conjuncture is shaped by a relation of forces as capital and the capitalist state abdicate the reproduction of labor power, leaving other agents, like households, again to fill in the gaps. I would thus modify Glaser's argument and refocus it on a relatively understudied angle of the work transfer, this process of abdication. My argument is not that the householder is performing labor for capitalism without a wage, as the domestic labor debates of the 70s argued, but I really want to emphasize the central role of abdication in the production and reproduction of key life-giving systems, such as water provision. So returning to this model, we can begin to concretely identify the high stakes of the work transfer reversal as water's production is pushed onto households. We've got examples of financial bills, late fees, hiring lawyers like you saw in the video, replacement sources like bottled water. Water has time costs, taking off work, traveling to offices, waiting your turn, figuring out the problem, or applying for social services. Hauling water into homes, avoiding physical injury, admin costs, the institutional and mental knowledge, efforts and capacities, and finally relational costs, finding and sustaining allies, advocates, and providers. The work transfer of water poverty articulates relations of power within the current conjuncture. For the working class, such as the people profiled in this talk, the household is a space increasingly abdicated by capital, but still fully internal to capitalism. It is left up to the modern welfare state to mediate these contradictions and enforce these relations of rule. I argue here that what the poverty technocracy is enforcing is not good governance or even rational water use or even welfare in the liberal sense, but a form of class rule. Class rule describes the rule of the few over the many, channeled through private power or ownership, a form of freedom held by the capitalist over the worker, and in the case of water, enforced by the welfare state. Here again, Stella, who describes the vibe in the DEP office. There was a woman, she said, called this other person over. Instead of talking to me, the attitude was, oh, you got to go get the meter, you know. And Stella said, what's going to happen now? And they said, well, you got to make a payment plan, and that, this and that. And then she flung the paper, the cease and desist paper, in my face and sent me away. This is a travesty because they treat people in a very condescending way, and the guard is there. You ask a question over and over. You're not doing anything. You try to understand. These are things she encounters routinely in government offices. Like, we're above the law and you must do what we say. Like, we're a separate entity when we're the taxpayers. They think we're not smart people. As a systemic problem, water inequalities require collective struggle. There is nowhere else to go than straight through. And I'll end with some insights from APE, who fully understand this, and I can talk more about them in Q&A. They say, we have reached the end of this advice session, but not the end of violation of rights. It is crucial that we persevere and that we make advice for space of collective struggle. If your energy or water rights have been violated, come and share your experience. And if you have already come, tell us about your progress and the steps you have taken in order to generate knowledge and collective strength. Thank you. Should I stand up here?
Yeah, that's
okay.
all right, if that's
Yes.
all right. But totally get a drink of water for sure. Just wanted to say thank you for the wonderful keynote in general. And just wanted to mention that we're going to open the floor for questions about hopefully your very insightful talk. So feel free to move towards the mic over here, while I also kind of prompt a question as well.
Great.
That kind of came up. And funny enough, it is your kind of last slide, which is kind of how do we progress forward from here? Specifically, how can we support our friends and neighbors who are impacted by plumbing poverty?
Should I just go ahead and answer this right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then people can start moving forward towards this mic here if you have any other questions while you're answering.
Great. I work very closely with APE, and I really take initiative from them in their articulation of this as a necessity for collective struggle. I think as poverty researchers, we can very easily begin to recognize the structural nature of the issue and the fact that individual solutions are perhaps temporary stopgaps or maybe solutions for that particular person, but not for the collective. It's not an actual means to eradicate something like water poverty. So APE is a great example because in 2014, like I mentioned, they initiated a ballot measure reform by signatures. They, I think, organized the largest and fastest signature ballot in Catalonia in the history of the region. It was like well over 100,000 gathered just over a few weeks. So the law went to the parliament, they approved it, and it established this kind of law and the social meter program that we know. But APE would never kind of rest on their laurels, if you will. They recognize this as a sort of incremental advancement in a long struggle to make water truly up to the ideals of the human right to drinking water and sanitation. That the long view of struggle, I think, is absolutely, it has to be collective. So I like the way that you frame that question, how do we support? Because I think the we is involved. This is not just like for poor people to deal with. This has to be something, water is relational. Therefore, it needs a collective power and strength in order to kind of transform the state of conditions that we're in right now. So it's a great way to ask the question. I'm glad you did. I didn't plant her, I promise. So one, it has to be collective, and two, the time horizon of struggle must be a long one. And I say that as someone from the United States where the struggle is, it began a long time ago and it's going to keep continuing. And I think that collective nature of struggle and power is the only way that we can even think of sustaining something as ideal as to truly realize the human right to drinking water and sanitation. And many of you in the audience can speak to that, I'm sure, but it's very apparent to me in these situations in New York and in Barcelona, A, how invisibilized this is, and that's part of the issue, and B, like that it really will require collective power. Not only lawyers, they're really nice, but suing is not the way to environmental justice. We have to think about this much differently. So one of the projects we have involved in the next year's thing called End Water Shutoffs, where we're building transnational solidarity between our partners in Barcelona with folks in Philadelphia who we've worked with as well, to bring some of these lessons and insights about how do you organize this, how does this work in New York City, hopefully with an audience that might be receptive to at least making that first step of incremental reform and change, with the idea that, you know, the long struggle is ahead. And I'll just end that APE just released on their Telegram, you know, a statement saying, you know, the reform that we did, the social meter program, was great, but that doesn't there's still thousands of households that are not accessing that for a variety of reasons, and that their real goal is a full guarantee of the human right to water without having to apply for it and go through a stack of forms, but to think about why do we put more work burdens on people in poverty? That's what the welfare system is doing in many ways, and we have to think about truly transforming that in a different way. Thanks.
God, public speaking pretty much.
You're tall.
Yeah, I guess I have lots of questions, but I just wanted to say, like, listening to your talk, basically every example you were giving, I could really like feel a lot of that very close to home, like within our region, from, yeah, like vulture funds buying up lots of property sitting empty for years, even decades, and like manufacturing this like housing crisis that is, again, just a system working as it should, as well as like actively disallowing people living in encampments from accessing or creating sanitary infrastructure, as well as like more recently, we got a new waste management system, and now it's privatized, at least the recycling, and is now they are doing the minimum legal requirement and are picking up recycling every second week, where a few years ago, the city started picking up garbage every second week, their justification being like, we want to encourage more recycling behavior. And now they have allowed recycling to also be every second week. And so if anyone's looking for any kind of research project, you should maybe see the weight data that is changing now. But I was hoping I would formulate a question by now, but yeah, I just wanted to say, like, it was really interesting and deeply upsetting to see how those all exist within the region and our surrounding areas. But yeah, so thank you. Good work.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Because you seem to know a lot. Tell me more about Ontario. Do you ever see situations of water debt or utility debt affecting households? Is that a thing here? I don't know. I'm really curious, though.
I know, so there are levels of protections throughout the winter,
Right.
like related to like rental payments and, yeah, utility debts, like they can't shut off heat and whatnot through the winter.
Right.
But I know they do through the summer. So,
Interesting, yeah. And on a heating
yeah.
planet, air conditioning becomes like a form of climate change adaptation.
Yeah, while
or
also perpetuating.
water, exactly. But like taking showers, we find in Barcelona is like, that is the most basic thing that people do in a very hot Mediterranean summer, and is very sticky and uncomfortable. And so water shutoffs are truly life-threatening events, especially for elder or people who are more precarious. So yeah, the kind of seasonality of this, or the temporary measures, and then you're sort of back to a state of normal. Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah, I would say it's more of just a full-on removing you from the housing itself.
They're kind of, yes, it's tougher to fully evict people in Catalonia, although they are. And they're now kind of one of the more alarming things I've seen over the last year is the kind of rise of these kind of white supremacy far-right gangs that are hired by these vulture funds and landlords to intimidate the hell out of household residents, squatters, so that they leave. And this is happening really all over Southern Europe, also in Italy, but it's also in Spain. So, yeah. Thank you. Elijah.
Thank you. My name is Elisha Okoth. My question is, first, a background, just building on the concept of work transfer. I was trying to draw a parallel between the global north and the global south where I come from. And what we have in some of the cities is something called the delegated management model, where we have the utility kind of contract a private firm to distribute water in low-income areas. And then all the utility cares about is for this private farm where they give them like a bulk water meter. As long as they pay that, the utility, they're good. But then it's the responsibility of this private farm to distribute water to low-income areas. So, of course, there are a lot of challenges with that, with the communities, because these people are business people. But then on the flip side, and I worked for the utility as well, and I remember our CEO would always say, like, I have workers to pay. I need to buy chemicals to treat the water. So my question is, how can, or rather, what are some of the strategies that policymakers can come up with so that maybe their policies considers both ends, because utilities also need to be self-sustainable and be run efficiently, but then also we have households needing water, and maybe they have to, I don't know, what are some of the strategies that policymakers can consider?
It's a really, really good point. I would point you to the work of Catherine Furlong, who's a professor in geography at the University of Montreal, and she's written some great work. She studies utilities for a long time in Colombia, the Netherlands, all over the world. And she really argues that the infrastructure finance, so if we just start with the utilities, we're starting in the middle of things. We have to take a few steps back and ask questions about how is it that this infrastructure finance model and the ways that utilities are run came to be, because it didn't just drop out of the sky or Santa left it as a nice present. We said, ooh, this is the way to do things. It is also a production. In the kind of, whether you're a private utility or a public utility or company or whatever they're called where you live, they're often organized around full cost recovery or some sort of revenue generation like the DEP is, meaning that they use the debt lien to kind of generate revenue for their own department and also other city departments. They are seen, Catherine Furlong argues that we have structured infrastructure finance as trickle-down debt. And so we both financialize water utilities and also energy companies with the idea of kind of generating new securitized, financialized models of infrastructure development, usually large ones, in order to raise revenue and, you know, award shareholders for investing in these companies. We also have, even in public utilities, this sort of model of debt recollection that's very uneven. It's fine for people who are paying subsidized rates, who are higher incomes, but obviously it lands differently on households that are lower. So I think what I would argue is, with Catherine, is that we need to really start with overhauling and reforming our systems of infrastructure finance and the ways that those governing logics operate, rather than look at the kind of poor person as like, oh, how do we assist you or help you better? Why is it that we are forcing them into situations of paying oftentimes more than their fair share? And that is a very geographic project, because water providers they operate and are structured differently from place to place. But I think we have seen a shift in the last 20 years, even in the global north, where they are expected to be financially self-sustaining, which is kind of crazy because water never has been a business that's going to make money. It's not like other commodities that can be sold. It often operates at a loss. So to ask these providers to suddenly become self-sufficient means that they're going to take it out on those who are most vulnerable, right? They're either not going to improve the infrastructure, so they'll just let it sort of deteriorate, and you see plenty of examples of infrastructure dysfunction, like Detroit, like Flint, Michigan, that leads to bad outcomes, or they're going to kind of crack down hard on ones to make sure that they pay, like what we see in the case of New York. So I think my long answer is that, yeah, we really need to think about infrastructure governance differently, the kind of compact of public service provision. And the state, I think, like it or not, we have to struggle with it in order to reform it to kind of work for collective power, rather than just for vulture funds or capital, which it's kind of doing right now.
Sorry, I'm
No
really
problem.
short.
I'm going to take a little sip while you're working that.
First, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your presentation. You spoke to the policing of water, and one of the examples you gave that was very upsetting, but not surprising, I guess, was the ban on collecting water from public fountains. And that ban on access to public services reminded me of something else that's happening locally, which I think kind of connects to what you were saying earlier about things happening here in Ontario. So specifically, about 45 minutes from here in Hamilton, Ontario, the City Council just voted to implement what they're calling an increased security measure for Hamilton Public Library, where anyone who doesn't have a valid library card is denied access to the public library. And I was wondering how, if you could speak to how measures like this feed into the stigma around poverty.
That's a big one. I would first say that some of these tactics and techniques that we see in terms of policing water is really about policing social reproduction, right? And that also has to do with all the social infrastructures that provision and reproduce life. And so that certainly extends to like public libraries. And there are different tactics and strategies, whether it's like an austerity strategy or whether it's sort of like something else at work. Yeah. I don't really know how else to comment other than if I swapped out the word water for some other vital, life-sustaining social infrastructure, we'd probably see similar dynamics at work. That's always my test to myself. Like, am I talking about water or am I talking about something else like power? And if I'm only talking about water too much, then I have to take a few steps back. I would say that it's sort of a geographic question as to how it unfolds across space and time and the kind of configuration of the community and place that you're in. But I think at least in the global north, we're seeing a abdication of what we might call public services, even though those services were never universal. Like, don't get into the romance of the welfare state was for all. People have always been struggling against that. But now we're sort of seeing I wouldn't even describe it as withdrawal. I would describe it as abdication, which is something a little bit more forceful, because I think that actually accurately describes the policing nature that we're seeing this of. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into like being punitive towards these people who are asking for help in these social services offices. Like, they're hiring folks. They're not very nice, not all of them, but some of them, in these stories that we hear and that we listen to. So I think abdication gives a sort of more forceful emphasis to this nature of the policing of social reproduction. There are other people across feminist labor geographies and political economy who have written about this in different sectors as well.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was great. I had a question about the New York example, and because it really struck me as something very shocking and scary. I think that we should all pay attention to. Just wanted to make sure that I got this correctly. Mm-hmm. So the man had an $800,000 property that was paid off in his name.
Correct.
The city had a bill that he never was informed of.
Right.
For several $1,000s, something
Yes.
that he probably was able to pay, potentially.
Potentially, yeah.
And without notifying him, they sold this off to basically cover that debt.
Correct.
So the city officials made the distinction, and I would imagine that they had other options available to them. Besides, they could have notified him. Mm-hmm. They could have tried to reconcile the situation. So basically what I'm getting understanding from this is city officials made the arbitrary distinction with their authority to basically put a hit out on this man's property so that private investors could swoop in and basically take the equity out from underneath him. Yeah.
So to defend the city a little bit, they say in the evidence that they presented for that case that they notified the man who lived at the Fillmore, I think his name is, who lived at the property in Brooklyn. Whether they did or not, I'm less interested in the kind of, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to arbitrate this case, but more in the kind of, almost structural insistence that you hear over and over again that we will not displace the system.
Right.
So the first piece of advice that anyone gets when they go to DP is make a payment plan. And you can tell that happens over and over again. They're interested in enforcing the system of repayment, not helping the working class person who's like, where did this bill come from? Why do I have, $3,000, $10,000 more owed to the city water department? Where did this come from? Yes, the debt lien system that PhD researcher Lucy Everett's doing her thesis on right now, and she's really the expert, is a system of accumulation off working class people's debt. And it's mirrors the property lien system, except under Mayor Eric Adams, he decided to include water debt as a sort of money-making opportunity as well. This is sold to investors. New York is very good at this. They're super good at like coming up with new financial savvy instruments for capital to accumulate and basically expanding they've already expanded into the sky. Now they're expanding the category of property into water, which is just as life necessary as housing is, and perhaps like immediately so in terms of not having an easy replacement. So the lien sale is a tricky little thing. I suspect that it's probably common in other US cities. When I was back visiting my brother over the Christmas holidays in Portland, Oregon, I did a little, I was like, let's do a little nosedive in the tax accountant's office. And sure enough, they have both a property lien and a water lien sale and system. So I think this is actually, it's probably not fair to penalize just New York City for doing this, because I think many places do, and to kind of remind us that this is a sort of conscious choice that we all uphold as people living in the city, in a place like New York. I think the questions arise, like, why is this so normalized? Why is it unheard of? These are like really terrible stories that come out all the time. Why are these voices never listened to before? Those are the ones that I'm kind of interested in cracking open a little bit, but you do have a good handle on the basics of how it works.
Wow, that's really shocking. Thank you for informing us about that.
Well, you're welcome.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. I found it quite impactful.
Okay.
Very, very troubling. I mean, it's abhorrent, the behavior and the treatment of people that you described. Those two examples of Barcelona and New York, were they chosen for practical reasons of where it would be easier to do research, or were they chosen as particularly poor examples of water access and work transfer? You mentioned a couple of times about it works differently in different geographies, even within the global north. Are there any examples where it works better, where we can look to of how things could be restructured to prevent that kind of thing happening?
Okay, I'm going to answer your second question first. One is, I think Barcelona actually works well as a model of organized struggle that's not innocent to what its short and long-term goals are, to kind of harnessing the collective power of voters to push reform. This was not something people in Parliament proposed. This was a people-proposed grassroots initiative that then became law. The social meter program is far more advanced than anything I've ever seen in the US or elsewhere, including Mexico, where I also work, and where there are many, many shutoffs, both because of non-payment and also because of rationing. So actually Barcelona, to my knowledge, is it working pretty damn well. And even with that, APE will say, and many people will say, this is not perfect. This is just sort of the first stop on our train to environmental justice. So that's the kind of first. The second, or the first question is, that research is never easy, and this research is really difficult. It's not easy to get people to talk to you on record about a very stigmatized thing like water insecurity. So we picked places that we wanted to kind of understand the production of plumbing poverty in the places we least expected. So we knew that coming in that New York City had the highest number, this is based on US Census data, highest number of households in total in the United States without running water. And we've tracked this over decades. And so we said, well, something's going on there. There's probably many of them are experiencing shutoffs like we have here. So that was one of our guiding points there. Plus, that was where my student Lucy wanted to do research. In Barcelona, we also knew that it was both a model of reform and something interesting, but we wanted to see what was going on as well. And I am integrated with a set of incredible researchers at several different universities who are comrades and friends. And so it was a place where we could kind of collectively work together on some of these things as we're doing. So that was the kind of rationale for why those places. We have some other case studies, Dublin, Ireland, Los Angeles, which a postdoc is starting up who's worked there for a long time next month. And then Bucharest, Romania, which will start later on this year. So we're trying to kind of really see in different geographies how this unfolds and how it's contested and how it works.
Thank you.
Hi, Don Saparis. I got here a little late, so I apologize, but I have a question. I don't think you covered it. The United Nations has a human rights declaration to safe, clean, healthy water and sanitation that shamefully Canada was relatively late in signing on to. I'm not sure if the U.S. has ever signed on to. I think half the world has still only signed on to this declaration. What is the hesitancy and what's the real story in the hesitancy?
I don't know if the U.S. federal government has signed on to the human rights to drinking water and sanitation, but I do know that many states and cities have, including New York State, where this place, it's in the state constitution. And that's also true for the state of California and other places. And sometimes at the city level as too, we see the human rights to water and sanitation. I am less wedded to the idea that the nation state at the federal level is going to come save us. In fact, when we look at climate action across the United States, which is a poor performer, we do see state level examples that are leading the way. Without California, none of the kind of real energy system transition things in the technosphere or any social programs would, because of that leadership at the state level, we see other places doing that. And that means kind of bottom-up work, not just top-down work. It's not to say that the nation-state scale is not important, but that's not the only place that incites policy change and transformation. And so I kind of think about it that way. In fact, it was Catalonia in Spain that actually pushed the human right to water through this law, the first to be passed. Spain didn't have that before. Now they do. Now it's kind of been adopted and replicated in other regions of the country, but that came from a bottom-up thing. I think the people power is what we, like, if I just put my faith in the technocrats at the federal level in the US to like make change, we're going to be here for a long time. So the people power of this, I think, is really what's important. And that's when we really see kind of struggle for the human right to water, that's the kind of North Star to follow, I think, when we think about transformation.
Mm-hmm. So is it safe to say that the hesitancy may be due to there's money in...
I don't know. Yeah,
Is it money as profit motivation that...
I have no idea.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thanks.
If you wouldn't mind staying up here
again.
So first of all, wow. And thank you so much for kind of finishing off on that note of kind of the North Star of really that people are at the core of it and people, a lot of ways, are the solution to it as well, and kind of bringing ourselves together like we are today in some ways. I think the biggest challenge, it seems, is the fact that, frankly, none of us knew about this, right? Or a fraction of us, or a large fraction, are in that place. So hopefully, on that note, we can kind of join together and kind of spread the word about this issue as well.
Thank you.
And your wonderful project. So if you wouldn't mind accepting this gift.
Yes.
Thank you
Much
so
pleasure.
much for
Thank you.
joining us again. And your just wonderful keynote speak. And yeah, just all the knowledge that you shared with us today. Please join me again in thanking Katie for her wonderful speech.
Thank you.